Did you know that one of the most common beliefs about Filipinos might not be entirely true? For years, many of us have heard the phrase crab mentality. It's often used to describe a behavior where people supposedly pull others down. Like crabs in a bucket, the story goes, whenever one tries to climb out, the others pull it back down. It's a powerful, simple image. And because of that, it has quietly shaped how many Filipinos see themselves in each other. But what if this story is incomplete? What if it is not the full truth, but only a shadow of something deeper? Let me tell you a story. In a small coastal town, there lived a young boy named Mateo. Every morning before sunrise, he would walk with his father to the shore. The air was cool, and the world was still quiet. His father was a fisherman, and every day was a chance, not a guarantee, to earn enough for their family. One morning, as Mateo helped carry a basket, he noticed something curious. Inside were crabs, moving and shifting, their claws reaching upward. "Why don't they escape?" Mateo asked. His father smiled gently. "Because when one tries, the others pull it back." Mateo frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Why would they do that?" His father paused, then said something Mateo would never forget. "Sometimes, hijo, it's not about wanting to pull others down. Sometimes it's just about trying to survive." Years passed and Mateo grew older. He left his town, studied hard, and eventually found success in the city. But as he climbed higher, he began to hear the same phrase over and over again. "Be careful. Filipinos have crab mentality. You made it, but others will try to bring you down. Don't trust too much. People get jealous." At first, Mateo believed it. It seemed to explain why some people criticized others and why success sometimes felt lonely. But something about it didn't sit right. Because when he looked back at his life, he remembered something different. He remembered neighbors sharing food when times were hard. He remembered friends helping each other study. He remembered strangers offering kindness. If Filipinos truly had a nature of pulling each other down, then where did all that kindness come from? So Mateo began to question the story. And what he discovered changed everything. The idea of crab mentality is often presented as a cultural flaw. But when we look closer, we see a different picture. Imagine growing up in a place where opportunities are limited, where jobs are scarce, and many struggle to get ahead. In that kind of environment, emotions become complicated. When someone rises, it can bring pride but also fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of not having enough. Fear that there may not be another chance. And sometimes, that fear can come out in ways that look like envy. But is that really about wanting others to fail? Or is it about trying to protect oneself in an uncertain world? Mateo realized something important. What people call crab mentality is often not about malice. It is about scarcity. It is about pressure. It is about survival. If 10 people are reaching for one opportunity, the situation itself creates tension. Not because the people are bad, but because the system is tight. But underneath all of that is something very human. The desire to be safe. The desire to belong. And one day, he stood again by the shore, watching the waves. He remembered the crabs in the basket, and he smiled. Because now, he understood something deeper. The crabs were not trying to harm each other. They were reacting to their environment. Placed in a confined space with no clear escape, they moved in ways that reflected their situation. But people are not crabs. People can reflect. People can choose. People can change the environment itself, and that is where the real power lies. Not in blaming individuals, but in transforming the conditions that shape behavior. So what can we do? We can start by questioning the stories we've been told. We can recognize that not every criticism comes from a place of harm. Sometimes it comes from fear. We can choose to respond with understanding instead of judgment. We can share knowledge, even when it feels easier to keep it. We can celebrate others, even when we are still on our own journey. Because every time we do that, we weaken the myth. And we strengthen something better, a culture of support. A culture of shared growth. A culture where success is not something to be protected, but something to be multiplied. Mateo's story is not just his own. It is a reflection of something happening quietly every day in classrooms, in workplaces, in communities. People are helping each other rise. Even if it's not always seen, even if it's not always talked about. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to tell a new story. Not about crabs pulling each other down, but about people lifting each other up. Not about scarcity defining behavior, but about resilience shaping it. Not about limitation, but about possibility. Because the truth is this, Filipinos are not defined by a mentality that holds them back. They are defined by a spirit that keeps moving forward. A spirit that adapts, that supports, that endures. And when that spirit is directed toward collective growth, something powerful happens. Communities grow stronger, opportunities expand, and success becomes something that can be shared. So the next time you hear the phrase crab mentality, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this the full story? Or is there something deeper beneath it? Because sometimes what looks like pulling down is really just a sign that the system needs to change. And when the system changes, behavior follows. Mateo looked out at the sea one last time before heading home. The waves moved freely, each one rising and falling, yet part of something bigger. And he realized that is what growth should look like. Not confined, not limited, but shared. And maybe that's the story we've been waiting to tell all along. In the heart of a city that never sleeps, the rain felt less like a blessing and more like a heavy burden for Sarah. Standing under a leaking bus stop roof, she checked her watch for the 10th time, her face a mask of exhaustion and stress. Her heavy briefcase felt like a lead weight, echoing the pressure of a day filled with missed deadlines and cold coffee. But through the gray mist of the evening, an elderly man named Elias approached, walking with a calm that seemed to defy the storm. He held a large, sturdy umbrella, its dark fabric a shield against the elements. He noticed the young woman's distress immediately. With a gentle smile that reached his eyes, he stepped closer and offered the handle to her, a simple gesture of unexpected grace. Sarah looked up, startled by the kindness of a stranger. She hesitated, her mind racing with the cynicism of the city. Elias simply nodded, gesturing for her to take it. "You need this more than I do tonight," his silent gesture seemed to say. He walked away into the downpour, seemingly unfazed by the water soaking into his beige sweater, leaving Sarah in stunned silence. Over the next few days, the umbrella became a constant companion. But more than that, it became a reminder of a moment of light. The weight of her stress began to lift. She found herself noticing the small beauties she had previously ignored in her rush. Kindness, she realized, was a choice of perspective that could change the texture of a whole day, even a whole life. One afternoon, as the clouds gathered once more, Sarah spotted a young student shivering without a jacket, caught in a sudden squall. Without a second thought, she stepped forward. The umbrella had served her well, but it was time for it to continue its journey. She handed it over, mirroring Elias's warm smile. In that moment, she felt the circle of compassion beginning to close. Weeks passed. The seasons began to shift, and the rainy days gave way to the golden warmth of a late autumn afternoon. Sarah was walking through the park when she saw a familiar figure sitting on a wooden bench, watching the pigeons. It was Elias. He looked more delicate now, but the same wisdom resided in the way he held himself against the cool breeze. Before Sarah could reach him, a third person, a stranger, walked up to Elias and handed him a steaming cup of tea. The man mentioned how a kind woman had helped him weeks ago, and he wanted to pay that kindness forward to someone today. Elias looked up and saw Sarah standing just a few feet away. Their eyes met, and a silent, knowing connection sparked between them. No words were needed. They both understood the power of the ripple they had started in that rainy dusk weeks ago. Kindness is a curious thing. It doesn't disappear when you give it away. Instead, it finds a way to grow and return. In a world that can often feel cold and indifferent, a simple umbrella can become a beacon of hope for many. The umbrella itself was seen once more, leaning against the wall of a cozy cafe, waiting for the next person who might need it. Remember, every small act of compassion has the potential to change someone's world in ways you may never see. Kindness is the only thing that doubles when you share it. Keep the circle moving. Stories have a quiet power. They shape how we see the world, and how we see ourselves within it. And when a story begins to change, something deeper begins to shift, not just in individuals, but in entire communities. As Mateo continued his work in the town, he began to notice something unexpected. The change was spreading, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. It showed itself in small conversations, in the way people spoke about each other, in the way they reacted to success and struggle. One morning, while walking through the marketplace, Mateo overheard two vendors talking. "Did you hear about Aina?" One said, "She got a job." The other nodded. "Good for her," she replied. "She worked hard for that." It was a simple exchange. But Mateo paused, because not long ago the tone might have been different. There might have been doubt, or quiet comparison, or a subtle question of fairness. But this time, there was something else. Respect. Recognition. And that's when Mateo realized the narrative was being replaced. But change, even when it is positive, is never perfectly smooth. Because as one mindset begins to grow, another may resist. One afternoon, a man named Thomas approached Mateo. He was older, experienced, and known in the town for speaking his mind. "I've been hearing about what you're doing," Thomas said. Mateo smiled. "I hope that's a good thing." Thomas crossed his arms. "You're telling people that crab mentality isn't real." Mateo paused, because he knew this moment mattered. "I'm saying," Mateo replied carefully, "that what we call crab mentality may not be what we think it is." Thomas shook his head. "I've seen it my whole life. People getting pulled down, opportunities being blocked, criticism when someone succeeds." "That's real," Mateo nodded. "Yes, those experiences are real. But the question is, why do they happen?" Thomas frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "When someone criticizes another's success, do you think it always comes from a place of wanting them to fail?" Thomas hesitated. "Not always," he admitted. "Exactly," Mateo said. "Sometimes it comes from frustration, from feeling left behind. If we only label it as pulling others down, we stop there. But if we look deeper, we begin to understand the cause. And when we understand the cause, we can actually do something about it." Thomas was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just thinking. "So you're saying," he finally said, "that it's not about denying the problem, but understanding it differently?" Mateo smiled. "Yes, because if we believe it's just part of who we are, then we feel powerless to change it. But if it's a response, we can change it." And that was the turning point. Because this conversation reflected something important. The shift from blame to understanding. In the weeks that followed, Mateo and the community began to take a new step, not just sharing stories, but building systems. They created simple support networks, a group where people could share job opportunities, a space where students could ask for guidance, a circle where small business owners exchanged ideas instead of competing in silence. Slowly, something began to change. Opportunities no longer felt like isolated chances. They became shared knowledge. Success no longer felt distant. It became visible and reachable. Mateo realized that isolation is one of the strongest roots of crab mentality. But when people feel connected, success becomes a source of learning. One evening, Mateo introduced a simple idea. What if we measure success differently? Not how high one climbs, but how many they bring with them. Imagine a ladder. Most think there's only space for one at the top. But what if that ladder can be extended? What if we build steps for others? A young entrepreneur started mentoring others. A teacher opened weekend sessions. A group of friends pooled resources. These were acts of understanding. But beyond the town, the old narrative still existed. Online, in jokes. Mateo knew the story had to be challenged in wider spaces. He began to speak beyond the town. Through talks and writing, he asked the same question. What if we've been telling the wrong story? One day, a message reached Mateo from someone he'd never met. I used to believe in crab mentality. I realized I was also afraid. But instead of letting fear control me, I started reaching out. I was surprised. People responded. Real changed lives and helping people see differently. As time passed, the phrase crab mentality began to lose its weight. One evening, as Mateo walked along the shore, he saw a group of children playing near the water. They had a bucket of crabs. One of the children pointed and laughed. "Look, they're pulling each other down." Mateo stepped closer, not to interrupt, but to observe. One child reached into the bucket. Gently, he lifted one crab out and placed it on the sand. The crab moved quickly free, and then one of them said something simple. "Maybe they just needed help," Mateo smiled. The story had already begun to change. The next generation was telling it differently. The waves moved, the horizon stretched wide. The future didn't feel limited. It felt open. Because when people stop seeing each other as obstacles and start seeing each other as allies, there is no limit to how far they can go. And this time they would not climb alone.